Conclusion. In this report, we provided insights into the dynamics of the threshold of violence model and the potential tactics violent resistance movements use to increase a population's tolerance for a group's use of violence against an incumbent government. We identified several potential strategies: the use of narratives and the provision of public goods and social welfare benefits to promote a society of resistance, and the use of a provocation strategy to goad an incumbent government into a disproportionate response. The threshold of violence model posits a situation in which rational decision-makers carefully evaluate the costs and benefits of using violence, attempt to anticipate their adversaries' actions, and subsequently choose a course of action that maximizes the benefits or utility to their group. While it represents a potentially useful framework for understanding the decision to use violence, there are other perspectives through which to evaluate this decision. Thus, it may be useful to briefly discuss other paradigms that explore the decision to use violence and highlight various limitations and qualifications to the threshold of violence model. First, identity and the desire for positive group status at the expense of other groups may influence cost-benefit calculations surrounding the use of violence. Evidenced in Michael Billig's book, Social Psychology and Intergroup Relations, social psychological experiments he conducted in the 1970s showed that participants placed in different groups exhibited strong group loyalty even when their group assignment was based on random, in other words, through a coin toss, or trivial factors, and even in the absence of face-to-face interactions with group and non-group members. Further experiments indicated that subjects, when prompted to apportion fictitious rewards between groups, preferred outcomes that maximized intergroup differentials and relative gains, even if this preference meant less absolute gains for one's group. Such findings led Donald Horowitz to argue that the desire to enhance relative group status was the prime motivation for ethnic conflict in his book, Ethnic Groups in Conflict. The importance of positive group status also plays an important role in Roger Peterson's emotion-based theory of ethnic conflict, depicted in his book, Understanding Ethnic Violence. Peterson argued that emotions such as fear, hatred, resentment, and rage play an important role in determining the targets and timing of ethnic violence. For instance, he noted that group-based resentment explains why Ukrainians in Soviet-occupied Poland attacked Poles once Eastern Poland fell under Soviet control in September 1939, and why they attacked Jews instead of Poles in 1941 after the German invasion of Soviet territory. In the former case, land, language, and education policies adopted by the interwar Polish government led to an ethnic hierarchy in which Poles were privileged at the expense of Ukrainians, despite both groups each constituting about a third of the population in eastern Poland. However, the Soviet occupation led to the devastation of the Polish community, with hundreds of thousands deported and many others victims of score-settling violence by Ukrainians. Additionally, Polish property was expropriated, Polish nationalist symbols were banned, and the language of instruction in educational institutions throughout eastern Poland switched from Polish to Ukrainian. The status of Jews in eastern Poland, which before September 1939 had been no higher than that of Ukrainians, was elevated by the Russian takeover, though. Jews, who had played an important role in the Communist Party in Poland, were recruited heavily into the new Soviet administration. Jan Karski, a Pole who wrote reports for the Polish government in exile, observed, quote, "They, Jews, are entering the political cells. In many of them they have taken over the most critical political administrative positions. They play quite a large role in the factory unions, in higher education, and most of all in commerce. But above and beyond all of this, they are involved in loan sharking and profiteering, in illegal trade, contraband, foreign currency exchange, liquor, immoral interests, pimping, and procurement. In these territories, in the vast majority of cases, their situation is better both economically and politically than before the war." End quote. Jews rather than Poles had become the Ukrainian status rival under the Soviet occupation. So after the German invasion, the Ukrainians attacked the Jews to put them back in their place. As this analysis indicates, calculations surrounding the threshold of violence may become clouded by group status concerns and various violence-inducing emotions that may be widespread among a population. More broadly, Ted Gurr, in his article titled "A Causal Model of Civil Strife, a Comparative Analysis Using New Indices," noted that psychological frustration in the form of relative deprivation is a fundamental precondition for civil strife. Gurr defined relative deprivation as the perception of the discrepancy between value expectations, that is, the goods and conditions of life to which individuals believe they are justifiably entitled, and value capabilities, that is, the ability to attain and keep value expectations. Violence, and more broadly, civil strife, are more likely the greater the magnitude and scope of relative deprivation within a population. Furthermore, as seen in the interactions between Jews, Poles, and Ukrainians in the period immediately before and after the Nazi invasion of the Soviet Union, relative deprivation, combined with group status concerns, can potentially contribute to the identification of targets of violence. Additionally, if a conflict between an insurgent movement and an incumbent government or outside force places at risk values deemed sacred by a host population, the latter may be more willing to tolerate violence to protect such values. In particular, Jeremy Ginges, along with his co-authors in their paper titled "Sacred Bounds on Rational Resolution of Violent Political Conflict," argued that once certain issues become sacred, they may no longer be amenable to conventional cost-benefit calculations because individuals tend to resist and regard as profane attempts to buy off their commitments to such values. For instance, in a poll of Israeli settlers, 46% of those surveyed indicated it was never permissible for Jews to forfeit parts of the land of Israel to Palestinians as part of a peace deal, regardless of the value of any benefits received in return. Similarly, 54% of surveyed Palestinian students indicated it was never permissible to compromise on the right of return of Palestinian refugees or over sovereignty over Jerusalem. Furthermore, more than 80% of surveyed Palestinian refugees indicated their unwillingness to compromise over the right of return to their original homes, irrespective of the benefits that may accrue from a peace deal. Clearly, such results indicate that for many people, sacred values are not fungible resources with a value that can be quantified and sacrifice that can be compensated through some form of material incentive or inducement. In fact, among such, quote, moral absolutists, according to Ginges et al., within the surveyed Jewish and Palestinian populations, their support for a violent opposition to a peace deal increased when they were asked to consider a hypothetical deal that involved some form of material compensation for a compromise on a sacred value. Interestingly, opposition among moral absolutists decreased when a hypothetical deal entailed a symbolic compromise by the adversary on one of their own sacred values. For instance, support for a violent opposition to a compromise among Palestinian refugees decreased if an agreement required Israelis to relinquish what they believed to be their sacred right to the West Bank, or if Israel symbolically recognized the legitimacy of the right of return. Hence, sacred values seem to exist on a separate plane and are judged by a different calculus than non-sacred values. The survey results indicate that compromises on sacred values can be achieved if the other side makes equitable sacrifices on values they deem sacred. Nonetheless, the larger point for our purposes is that the presence of sacred values placed at risk may make a host population tolerate greater levels of violence, although such willingness may be tempered by the immediate material consequences of violence, as demonstrated by the previously noted Palestinian woman who blamed Hamas for the Israeli destruction of her home during Operation Cast Lead. Furthermore, given its relevance to the threshold of violence model, we discussed at length the key features of the rational choice paradigm. However, it is also important to note other decision-making frameworks that may also be relevant in the decision by governments or insurgent leaders to use force. Developed in response to critiques that rational choice models do not accurately reflect actual decision-making, prospect theory argues that how choices are framed for decision-makers is an important factor in understanding decision-making. Framing effects are not captured in rational choice models, although they often manifest themselves within controlled experiments, as noted by Rose McDermott in her book, Risk-Taking in International Politics. Quote, "The first experiment asked people to pretend that they were responsible for making public policy in the face of a major flu epidemic that was expected to kill 600 people. They were asked to decide between two different programs that were each designed to contain this epidemic. The choices were presented to the first group as follows. Policy A will save 200 people. Policy B has a 1/3 chance that 600 people will be saved and a 2/3 chance that no one will be saved. In this case, 72% chose the first option. The second group was presented with these choices. Policy A will cause 400 people to die. Policy B has a 1/3 chance that no one will die and a 2/3 chance that 600 people will die. In this case, 78% chose the second option." End quote. Both policies A and B entail the same number of expected survivals, 200, and deaths, 400. Yet decision-making differed drastically based on how the choice was framed. The first choice emphasized a saving frame, whereas the second choice emphasized a death frame. Rational choice theory would predict that decision-makers would be indifferent as to how a choice was framed, which was clearly not the case in this example. Hence, prospect theory argues that how a choice is framed impacts decision-making. Specifically, choices can be framed as gains, that is, saving lives, or losses, that is, deaths. Furthermore, if decision-makers find themselves in a domain of gains, or when things are going well, they tend to be risk-averse, while in a domain of losses, or when things are going poorly, they tend to be relatively risk-seeking in an effort to recoup losses. While prominent in the field of behavioral economics, prospect theory has also been used to evaluate political and military decision-making. For instance, McDermott argued that prospect theory is useful in understanding President Jimmy Carter's April 1980 decision to attempt a military rescue of U.S. diplomats held hostage by Iran. Specifically, she argued that because of domestic and international developments, Carter found himself in a domain of losses. Internationally, U.S. prestige suffered in the wake of the hostage crisis, and Carter's failure to secure the release of the hostages during the first 5 months of the crisis led to a sharp drop in public support for the administration and increased congressional pressure for the administration to resolve the crisis. From the perspective of prospect theory, President Carter was operating in a domain of losses, which made him relatively more willing to accept risk when reviewing options because of his desire to reverse both domestic and international setbacks. Thus, prospect theory offers a potentially useful correction to the rational choice model, and may therefore offer insights regarding the decision to use violence by insurgent leaders. We can see that there are a number of potential qualifications to the threshold of violence model. Nonetheless, keeping these reservations in mind, in certain contexts, the paradigm presented by the threshold of violence model can potentially be a useful starting point to understanding resistance movements' decisions to use violence. As we have seen, insurgents can potentially use a provocation strategy to raise a population's upper threshold of violence, and this strategy produces a number of competing effects. On the one hand, a government crackdown can promote insurgent mobilization and greater support for the use of violence if a counterinsurgent campaign produces widespread damage and personal loss throughout a population. On the other hand, The desire to limit damage and the lack of faith in the ability of insurgents to provide security may lead host populations to try to rein in the activities of violent resistance movements and even to seek the succor of the incumbent, assuming the host population does not conclude that the incumbent seeks its obliteration or displacement. If a provocation strategy is employed, the incumbent, which can be a domestic authority or foreign power, then decides whether to initiate a discriminate or indiscriminate campaign, and the public decides whether to support the incumbent or the rebels. Perceptions of violence by the general public may be influenced by a number of qualifying factors, including whether counterinsurgent violence is perceived as proportionate, that is, force is limited to what is necessary to achieve military objectives and collateral damage is minimized, whether distinctions between military and civilian targets are observed, whether the use of violence against opposing forces is militarily necessary, and whether armed forces limit themselves to tactics and weapon systems that do not cause unnecessary injury or suffering. Perceptions regarding the ability of a resistance movement to provide protection to a populace will likely factor heavily in whether the latter sides with the incumbent or the resistance movement if the incumbent launches an indiscriminate campaign. As Kalivas noted, quote, "Assume a setting where incumbents choose whether to use indiscriminate or selective violence. Insurgents have the option of protecting civilians from incumbent indiscriminate violence, and civilians collaborate with the political actor who best guarantees their security. In such a setting, civilians will be likely to collaborate with the incumbents if the insurgents fail to protect them, whether incumbents are indiscriminate or selective. They will be likely to side with the insurgents when they are protected by them against indiscriminate incumbents, and the outcome is indeterminate when insurgents protect civilians and incumbents are selective." End quote. Lastly, we end our discussion by noting the paucity of theoretical models that can accurately depict the necessary and sufficient minimum level of violence a resistance movement must employ to secure a specific concession. As DiNardo noted, there is no formal model that can accurately indicate an optimal level of violence for any given situation. Although the comments below are in the context of social movements contemplating an escalation to violent tactics, they can also apply to violent insurgent and resistance movements contemplating how much violence to use to gain concessions from an incumbent, or to implement a provocation strategy. Quote, "Given our reasoning about responsiveness and recruiting, the natural question to address at this point is whether any simple, monotonic or single-peaked association exists between the level of violence used by the movement and the concessions it receives. Are tactics ranked in effectiveness, for example, strictly according to their proximity on the continuum of violence to the optimal choice, in such a way that the dissidents will converge directly on the best tactic by a simple process of trial and error? The answer to this question is that no simple relation necessarily exists between tactics and concessions. On the contrary, the optimal tactic can in general lie anywhere along the continuum of violence, and more importantly, there can be no assurance that other tactics will smoothly diminish in effectiveness as they diverge in either direction from the optimal choice. It follows that locating the optimal tactic will often be no easy matter for dissident leaders, and that a highly detailed assessment of the political environment, probably unattainable in most cases, will be necessary to predict in advance the relative potential of each kind of violence." End quote. While it may be the case that a theoretical model of sufficient granularity and realism is currently out of reach for connecting violence with coerced concessions, empirical studies utilizing econometric and statistical techniques on micro-level data, for example data on specific tactics and weapon systems employed, geolocated data on casualties caused by insurgents and/or incumbents, may offer a fruitful path toward answering specific questions regarding whether certain tactics and operations violate a community's tolerance for violence. For instance, Ben-Melek, Berebi, and Clore noted that a one standard deviation increase in punitive house demolitions by Israel which targeted actual Palestinian suicide attackers and enablers, led to a decrease of 11.7% in the number of suicide attacks emanating from an average district. Meanwhile, a standard deviation increase in the number of precautionary house demolitions, which were justified by the location of the house and were unrelated to the actions of the house owner, led to a 48.7% increase in the number of suicide attacks from an average district. This empirical finding bears directly on the threshold of violence because it identified a particular tactic that exceeded a community's tolerance for violence. And it affirms the earlier observation by Kalivas that perceptions of fairness, in particular being subjected to violence independent of one's actions, impact a public's reaction to a counterinsurgent campaign. Another empirical study with direct relevance to the threshold of violence was the analysis of collateral damage conducted by Kondra and Shapiro using Iraqi data. As previously noted, the authors found that an increase in civilian casualties caused by coalition forces led to an increase in insurgent attacks on coalition forces, while an increase in civilian casualties caused by insurgents led to a decrease in such attacks. However, by decomposing insurgent attacks on coalition forces into various types, specifically direct fire, indirect fire, IED, and suicide attacks, the authors found that this trend was only present for direct fire insurgent attacks on coalition forces. This form of attack, the authors noted, was the most susceptible to detection by non-combatants during the setup phase, and therefore this study provides a more granular analysis of how violations of the threshold of violence might play out in practice. As noted earlier in the text, the mechanism through which these dynamics are effectuated is through the provision or non-provision of information by non-combatants to coalition forces. Interestingly, and also as noted earlier, Kondra, Felter, Iyengar, and Shapiro noted that this information effect was not present in Afghanistan. Rather, in the Afghan context, a revenge effect, whereby people directly impacted by coalition violence acted out revenge by joining a resistance movement offering such an opportunity, was the driving factor explaining increases in violence against coalition forces. The authors noted that an information effect is a short-run effect because information can be shared and acted upon immediately, whereas a revenge effect involves a relatively lengthier process because it takes time for a resistance movement to incorporate new recruits. Hence, if appropriate micro-level data exist, well-crafted empirical studies such as these may provide useful insights on mechanisms surrounding the practical unfolding of violations of the threshold of violence, and ensuing results can be compared across contexts.